I believe we're at episode 13. Today, I'm thrilled to announce and introduce Chantal Veillon, a global HR leader who is a business executive and an inspiring mother of three. Her career has spanned multiple industries and companies such as GE Healthcare, BMS, Honeywell, and now where she serves as Executive VP and Chief Human Resources Officer at Integra Life Sciences. Her journey is a powerful example of resilience, continuous learning, and heart. She's got a huge heart, and I thought that was something that the audience would really appreciate into how she's made it where she's at. So Chantal led major global transformations at BMS, navigated challenges like the cell integration and the pandemic, and has been a driving force behind culture change and organizational growth at every step. But beyond her impressive career, she's a devoted mom to three young adults who keep her inspired and on her toes. She's also a passionate believer that the only constant in life is change, which I thought was really inspiring, and no day should end without a good laugh. Today, we'll dive into how she balances her high-powered career with motherhood and what keeps her motivated through it all. So, Chantal, welcome. Thank you so much. I'm so blessed to have you on. I would love to just hear a little bit more about what you have going on right now, currently.
Wow. Well, and first, thank you for having me, Aurelia. And I'm so thrilled to be here with you today. And it's I know your podcast is very appreciated, and have listened to several episodes. So well done on that. So what's going on right now? We've got a lot going on at Integra Life Sciences. My company is a mid-sized medtech company, and we're on a quite interesting path. About to welcome our incoming CEO. She's a very strong, woman leader with decades of medtech industry experience. And she is a leader. It's a woman CEO, which is very exciting, when you think about, there is so few of those women CEO in the industry. I'm very thrilled. She will start with us in January, and we're all waiting for her very impatiently.
Oh, it's so exciting. That's wonderful. So that segues so beautifully into it. I was so excited to have you on as just leaders and more women in leadership. I think it's so important to start creating more people that can mentor others as well. So for you, Chantal, what core principles for you do you feel have been constant for you as you've rapidly progressed in your career? I feel like sometimes those principles, they really do stay the same. They may have evolved over time, but what are those core principles for you?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And you don't necessarily think about that at the beginning of your career. You're moving on, with the flow, I would say. But what's been really constant with me are a few things. First of all, I've always been working in highly changing and evolving environment. And as I started my career in video games, every year we were divested or taken over, depending on which side of the coin you're looking at it. And I thought, for the first 4 years of my career, this is absolutely normal life. You change name every year, you change, group every year, and there's something new which is happening absolutely every year from a corporate perspective, plus, everything else, around the business. So change has been definitely a constant, and that's something that has been shaping me, and that I actually, that I'm looking for. It's something which is motivating. This is something which I'm good at, and I'm not a very steady state person, as a matter of fact. The other thing which has been probably rooted in my own, I would say my own values, but also my upbringing and my training is integrity. And integrity translates in so many different ways. It is being true to yourself and honest to yourself, honest to your value, and not try to be somebody else or try to fit into an environment that is definitely not in line with your own values. I had to make those choices, several times across my career, and realizing that even though, the company might really appreciate my service, I was not necessarily in line anymore with the company's values and agenda. And I think it's important also to use integrity as a leader and be a role model and speak the truth, to inspire others, but also to provide that confidence and that safe space for people to be able to speak up. So these are, I would say, the two core principles that have been really guiding me very consistently throughout my career.
I love that. And it also sounds so much that you've been able to flex, because not only with the change, being able to just flex and navigate and be adaptable, which I think is such an important quality of a great leader, but all not just through like the change, but also culturally, right? You had talked to me a little bit about that. How have you been able to navigate through different cultures, whether it's culture of being in a different country or culture of just the environment of a different culture of company, right? Going from a BMS to an Integra. How have you been able to adapt there?
Yeah, that is something that I've discovered, along the way, and not all corporations are coming equal. They've got their own culture, they've got strong values or not, and sometimes, you really need to be curious and understand that. To me, what's important is to take the company where it is, and before you try to influence, you need to go with the good and the positive that the company can bring you in terms of culture, and not try to go against the grain and looking behind and thinking, that was better in my previous company, or we were doing this in this previous company that I don't find in this other company. It is not very productive and actually quite disruptive and disengaging, for many people. So navigating the various culture is something that requires, I would say, a lot of humility and a lot of self-reflection. Yeah. You need to be conscious of your own, I was mentioning that at the beginning, your own values and what is going to fit and what is not going to fit, and where you're going to need to flex and morph maybe into something different and learn from it.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. And sounds like you have just built a capacity for self-awareness over time too, to be so aware of where you need to adapt, and not a doubt that those younger leaders too, as they grow within their careers, they just need to adapt to flex. What advice might you give just to any young leaders or even female leaders as they're starting in their careers, or maybe midway through their careers, on how they can adapt and flex as people are changing roles and companies on a pretty often, a lot more often than in the past?
Yeah. So one of the things I've done, and I've found it particularly, powerful and helpful, was to take advice before joining the company, understanding the company culture. And I did that actually before joining GE Healthcare. GE was, at the time was well known for having a very strong culture and a very specific one. Not everyone is fitting into GE, if you will. And very often, people are saying, once you've been a GE and you've adapted to that, you've got blue blood. And it's pretty true, I have to say. But I did a lot of homework and, spoke to people who had been at GE, who were still at GE, to understand what is the culture, what really matters. You can, there's things you might not be fully up to the task or up to the level, but it's going to be okay. And what are the absolutely mandatory values or prerequisite, in terms of culture and performance that are important with the companies. Getting some advice, getting some information from a broad array of people is really important. And because if you go alone, if you're staying alone in these changes, in this transition, it is very likely you're going to hit a wall and there's something, which is not going to go well at some point. I've always found very useful also to have some mentors and people who are, whether they're formal mentors or informal mentors, people who know you well, who are going to be able to help you see things, from a different vantage point. It's hard to look at yourself in the mirror and be fully self-aware. This is the harder thing. And I think, it's never a done deal. I don't know who knows oneself, perfectly. It's always work in progress. You need people who are going to tell you, well, this is your typical you, or, this is how you're behaving and the way you're feeling in these circumstances and the way you're showing up. I had the chance, to have either managers or mentors who've been very good at providing me with those type of feedback and reflections, and that helps tremendously to navigate, to navigate the nuances and the changes in terms of culture. I will share that anecdote. Yeah, my first manager at GE Healthcare, the person who hired me there, gave, that was a gift, because he told me, well, at some point he told me, well, I don't know you realize that, depending on, you've got high energy or low energy in a Teams meeting, the whole room is following your energy. and you've got a huge impact and a huge influence. If you're laughing, you're enthusiastic, the whole room is going to follow you. But if you're down and you're more quiet, the full room is going to be also following you. And you need to be conscious of that. You need to be very, very conscious of that. And since then, I have to say that that's been one of the best things I heard in my career. As I know if I'm down, if I'm having a so-so day, I'm trying to protect others from myself and my own influence.
And how do you do that, Chantal? Like when you're
Well,
having...
I'm just conscious that I might have a day where I'm really tired, as an example. Everybody has that, right? Everybody can wake up in the morning and say, you know what, that day is going to be a long day, and I don't have that much energy. So when you're conscious of that, first of all, you can warn people. You can tell them, well, I'm a little bit tired, I had a bad night, whatever it is. You don't need to justify yourself, but you can give them a little bit of a warning, so they're not expecting you to be your usual self, if you will. Or you can minimize also the number of interactions. You can think about other mechanisms to protect others. It's less about me than about others.
I love that, because that or at least a lot of the leaders that I'm talking to, it's one of those big things that, when you're stressed or you're not feeling great, I mean, that rolls downhill. People start worrying that, they might not have a job tomorrow, and it's totally just because you didn't get enough sleep. So I love that you're protecting others from that certain type of energy. That's really, really, that's powerful. It's really powerful. Sounds like you have sought out the uncomfortable too, which I think is really important for all of us to seek out mentors and coaches. I'm a big person who's always got coaches around me, people that need to challenge me, not tell me I'm doing a great job, but where do I need to get better? And it sounds like you've had a lot of those. So what might be just one? I know you probably have hundreds and hundreds of interactions, but a memorable relationship that you think really impacted your leadership journey or even your style over time?
Well, yeah, I think there's several, but I might actually pick on my, my first boss, who's been altogether a great, I would say a great manager, but also a great mentor in helping me navigating, through my first steps in the corporate world. This person, I mean, I've used him as a mentor, throughout the years. Probably a little bit less now, but he's been having such a big influence with me. And he really shared, some very core principles, which I've been speaking to Integrity. And he's been really teaching me this, this notion of not only being authentic, but also being full of confidentiality, being mindful of, you may have some information that are really important and you don't want to use that to your own benefit. So your own personal integrity versus, your position is going to be tremendously important. He also taught me so many different things, like things I'm still using today. A company is not a democracy. And that's a big one. Very often, people think they have a voice on everything and anything, and we're going to go by consensus or a vote. But it's not the case in a company. A company is not a democracy. At some point you make a decision and you have to align to that as an organization. So it's been a great mentor in the way that it's been truly helping me to gain confidence, in my abilities. It's been also stretching me and pushing me beyond, at the very beginning of my career, I didn't know I was capable of doing all he's been giving me to do. I had really no idea. He's been throwing me in situation. I was like, what, I'm going to do this multi-million-dollar, contract. I'm going to be in charge of this negotiation. I can't believe that. And he did. So it's fantastic when you've got someone like that who's really creating confidence and safety net at the same time, when you're starting your career.
I love that. So not a doubt that's inspired you to be the leader that you are and giving back and developing others and helping build their confidence too. That's amazing. I feel like everyone has someone, and they're so lucky and so fortunate. Well, most people do, right? And if you're lucky if you have that person that's going to be there to support you. And also, Chantal, for you, I know we had talked about this before, that you are very much a continuous learner. We've already heard that, right? Just the threads of what you've talked about. What you are, it sounds to me, a very naturally curious person. But how has that impacted you? Just being just a continuous learner, someone who's always curious. I definitely believe none of us have ever made it. We need to constantly be curious.
Yeah. Well, to me, that's really a way of life. I love to discover, and learn about many different topics, and I've always approached things as, you don't need to be the expert in the room to have legitimacy. But at the same time, if that gives you a little bit more confidence, to understand at least, wh- what is the topic you're talking about, you can be in that learning mode. And I was reflecting on how people do learn and what matters to them. Some people are going to be learning on the job, they're going to learn by practicing. Some people are going to learn, by going and exploring topics, watching videos, listening to podcasts, reading articles, reading books, there's talking to other people. I think it's important to recognize, that not everyone is the same type of learner, and it's a different journey depending on people. But for me, learning is something that helps you grow, that also gives you altogether more confidence and helps you ask better questions. I actually was reading lately about a syndrome. You've got people, the less you know, actually, the less you think you know. And that's a little bit of a conundrum, because some people are going to assert things, while they know very little about something. And the more you know, the more you're going to doubt, and the more you're going to ask questions and you're going to probe. And actually, this is very powerful to realize, because there is that notion of, well, sky is the limit in terms of learning, and nobody can have all the knowledge, but you can definitely have in your hand, the way you're going to approach that and use it. And asking better question to me is the ultimate experience in learning, because the more curious you are, the better your question, the more insightful your questions are, and the more powerful it can be.
Agreed. That is powerful. I think, right, asking questions and not always having to be necessarily the smartest person in the room or even fake that. Just ask the questions if you're not sure. So for you, we're just out of curiosity, do your what's your learning style or your go-to for learning, and what do you encourage your team to do as far as learning? Do you know their styles and what they like, whether it's books or podcasts or online learning in person?
Yeah. So I really like, going into podcasts and reading articles, but also talking to people then, to dig a little bit further into the topics, or, whatever. It's really multi-source learning. I know, some people really need to, in my team, they really need to take the time to digest the information. If you're feeding them on the spot and you ask them to react, it's not going to sit well. And we're all different learners. Some are going to just go with it and run, and say, well, yeah, fantastic. We've got all that set of data and we've got all this new set of information and we're able to run with it. And some will have to digest, in for a longer period of time and then come back, very often, it was very insightful inputs. I think it's very personal. At the end of the day, it's very personal, and there's not a right or a wrong way to learn. To me, the most important thing, the quality of the meeting should be measured to the number of questions which are being asked, and how much, we're able to challenge each other. It's not challenging, to put people in on the spot, but it's really to help, the thinking progressing and helping understanding, do we have any blind spots? Is there anything, we've not been considered? Have we really looked at through all the angles of the house, to consider the problem statement?
Yeah, that's great, right? And what you were saying is, not challenging each other, but doing it obviously in an empathetic and kind of kind way. And I know that's a big thing for you, is just empathy in your leadership style. What, why is that so important? Was that from just how you've learned to lead, or why is empathy so important, for you in your role?
Well, I think empathy is really a trait of a good leader. And it's not easy. I won't say that I feel empathetic, every day and I'm succeeding there. But I think, it is important to get the best out of people. And you really need to meet them where they are. I really learned that notion of meeting people where they are, as I was going through a number of transformation, including, that cell gene integration, which was a great learning. Being empathetic is also taking into consideration the human being, beyond the professional setting. Everybody's coming in, with their own life, with their own problems, with their own joys and projects, and spending some time in understanding this without being inappropriate is tremendously important. When you know one of your team members is going through a difficult moment, you really want to take that into consideration and show empathy, not only, by what you're saying, but the way you may protect the person during a meeting, or, excuse the person, who just cannot attend, and give a hand, give a friendly hand to bring them along.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, it's funny when we do in one of our programs, we ask people to share a defining moment, and oftentimes that's the lens is like everyone looks around and they're like, oh wow, everyone is dealing with something, and that empathy. It's just before I have that direct conversation, maybe I need to build some trust and find out what's going on with that person. For you, what might be a defining moment that you think really shaped your style in leadership? One defining moment, two defining moments. Is there something that stands out?
Yeah, I think there's really two ones that have been very eye-opening, and I would say from a different vantage point. The first one, was when I was asked to co-lead the women's network at GL, and that was back at the time I was in France, and I remember, realizing, when you're reaching an age where people are projecting on you a number of things, and that the group of women there, they were sharing about all these projections, even though they might not be, they might not have a partner, they might not be planning to have children, they may have a complete different life. They were sharing, how difficult it could be to be a woman in the corporate world with all these projections. That was such an eye-opener, for me. I had been progressing, pretty well. I had, of course, encountered a number of, I would say, surprises in the corporate world, including, some very odd question I thought I would never get. But I had navigated this, I had navigated on my own. When I found that group of people, not only that was an eye-opener to realize, the breadth and the depths of the question around women in leadership, but also realizing that being with a group of women and also men, I would say, which are tremendously important as sponsors, allies, and so forth, was actually something that I thought, I would carry with me my entire life. And since then, I was sharing that actually with our own women's network, at Integra, as I'm their sponsor a week ago or so. And I was telling them that defining moment has been with me, since then. And I'm a big advocate for these resource groups, which are tremendously powerful. The other defining moment is way more personal in the way, I was about to move to the US with Bristol Myers Squibb, and my boss at the time told me, who knew me well, she had hired me, and she told me, well, you're going to move to the US, you're going to work with teams in the US. You have to be way more authentic. You need to relax. You don't need to wear that suit that you're wearing. I know you're a different person. Just be that person. It's going to be perfectly fine. Be your authentic self, and you're going to be you're going to do very well. And that was at some point, at this point where she told me this. One, I realized I was trying to be somebody else, and I was trying to be somebody I'm not really that person. I like to laugh. I like to have fun. It's really who I am. And I was not being, my usual self. The other thing that, she gave me permission to remove some of the codes of the corporate world in a way, and define, what is my own leadership style. And that was probably one of the best things, she could do, and the best advice. That was a very simple moment. I will remember that all my life. And she really gave me that permission that really opened up to, many more possibilities.
Oh, wow. And Chantal, when you say she gave you permission to develop your own style, was there something specific about that she was referring to?
I don't think she knew herself, because as a matter of fact, I had been wearing some sort of a suit, trying to morph. We were talking about culture previously, and I felt, I had to morph into a certain culture, more hierarchical, more formal. And that was absolutely not the world I was coming from, in my previous companies. They were not at all, in that type of culture. So I was trying to fit in, if you will. You hear often, teenagers and saying, I want to fit in, I don't want to be different, I don't want to be the bizarre person, if you will. And what she told me was basically, well, you don't necessarily need to fit in, you can be yourself, still, being respectful and cognizant of the culture of the company, but you can be yourself.
I absolutely love that. I've been talking to a lot of leaders about that too, where I feel like when they're not bringing their authentic self and they're watching in a meeting, they're watching another leader and they're trying to emulate that, they struggle and they feel even more nervous and just they don't feel like they can express themselves when they start to just let them, obviously be appropriate, right? But when you let yourself laugh a little bit, that's okay.
Absolutely. And I think, if you're stopping to be so guarded, if you will, that multiplies your capacity to be empathetic, that multiplies your capacity to play on your strengths, rather than trying to work on something, which is using a lot of your energy and not necessarily in the right way.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. And then you connect at such a deeper level with people. People can sense it. They sense it when you're on guard versus when you're just, open and being yourself. Uh, I wanted to ask you this question because I haven't asked a lot of leaders about it, but just your thoughts about, because we're talking about some just leadership in general and with, females in leadership, I think are really important to continue to develop and just developing everyone, but also generations. So there's so many stereotypes and I'm curious whether you're seeing them. I'm seeing less of it now. Actually, I'm hearing less of it now, but I don't know if that's the same for you. But just like, what are your thoughts on that? And then what advice would you give to leaders that are struggling, either being in the younger generation, saying they're struggling with an elder generation or vice versa? Is there any advice that you would give?
Yeah. So, excuse me.
No worries.
I think there is still a lot of stereotypes. I am seeing it, I don't want to say on a daily basis, but on a weekly basis. Certainly there's going to be something that pops up that tells me that between generations, we're still not necessarily understanding each other, fully. I don't believe it's a one size fits all. We've all seen those charts, saying, well, Gen Z, they're operating that way, and boomers, they're operating that way, their values, and so on and so forth. Well, I think it's not that black and white. There's probably, more gray zones than we want to admit. Having said that, I think, our relationship to the way we consume information, the way we're using social media technology, the way we're also thinking about our own, what success means, are true differences between generations and things, that have to be, that I think, everybody needs to think about. You mentioned that I've got 3 daughters, and very interestingly, very often, very frequently, my daughters have told me, well, I don't want to do a job like yours. And it's hard to hear, to be honest. You're like, okay, what image am I protecting? What's my legacy there? And it's not that they're not appreciative, they're very appreciative, but actually they don't necessarily recognize, they're gonna fulfill their mission in life and fill their cup, if you will, both from an emotional perspective, a social perspective, bringing something to the world which is meaningful, because they're absolutely not living in the same context. And you have to take that into account. So you cannot cancel that. We're having a lot of discussions at home around, how don't you dismiss, ideas and opinions, the way or the younger generation are consuming information. My husband is a journalist by training, and he's very specific about, checking on, your sources, information, and so on and so forth. Of course, we've got the teenagers and young adults who are consuming TikTok and Instagram and all the other medias, and they're getting the, but this is there, this is on these media, and it's like, no, cross-check your facts, it's not necessarily the truth, and that is creating a lot of animated discussion, because as a matter of fact, they're also having some level of truth, in what they're saying, and also the way they're perceiving and living, this information. So I do believe it's a little bit more complex, than those very simple charts we're seeing on a regular basis.
That's so true, right? They're getting their information differently. I laugh with some of my friends where we say when, way back, we'd be at the dinner table having a conversation and we'd have to pick up an encyclopedia book or like get a newspaper to get our facts. And now everything is right on their phone, right? Just to look it up and you have the answer immediately, the supercomputer in your pocket.
Yeah,
That's really interesting. And that's great to hear that because I definitely believe that, right? We put a lot of people in different buckets and there's
absolutely. I think, the stereotypes are, I don't think we can, I'm not doing well with stereotypes. I always have a hard time with that.
yeah, they're dangerous at times because they can break down a lot of communication and create resentment. And speaking of that, for you, how do you create environments? So when you hear things like stereotypes or challenges within a team or others that you're working with, how do you specifically create an environment where people feel empowered, they can have direct communication, they feel confident, especially when things are constantly changing? Because I know when you started, there was a lot of change that was happening.
Yeah, it's really important in a team where you've got so many changes or, there can be some mounting tensions, not necessarily between the team members, but because of the pressure of the business to create a space where people have the time to pause and reflect. I think it's also very important for a leader to shut up, literally, and let the team express, what they have to express, discuss, between themselves, and you listening is tremendously important. I've seen, a variety of leadership styles. Some leaders really like to talk first, and basically they can also shut down the whole room by, expressing, their point of view, or they're going to go last and everybody's going to be like, all right, but if, that person goes last, the leader goes last, is our point of view going to be really taken into consideration, because we might also be dismissed and all the work we've done might go to waste. So it's important to find the right balance and contract with your team on how you're going to operate. And at some point, also make a decision, as a matter of fact. I mean, you just cannot let it go forever. But it's part of creating a safe space where people feel, they can express their point of view. I don't think there's any expectation that everybody's going to win, in some ways. My way, the highway, this is going to be my decision. I'm going to be able to implement my thing. But you really want to have a space where people can express honestly their point of view, get questions, be valued. There's always something to be leveraged in anyone's expression. I would say it's really important to pay attention.
Yeah.
And you need to create create a framework to allow for that. It's not happening by chance. You need to be also very conscious on how you're driving your meetings and your exchange within your team.
Chantal, what you just said, really reflects a lot, I think, what we're talking about too with psychological safety. And sometimes people feel like it's just the leader's responsibility or human resources responsibility. And I think it's peer to peer. So how you create that. What advice would you give to leaders in a meeting to encourage that safe space for people to exchange ideas and not feel shut down?
Well, I think it's important not to react on the spot, and it's hard sometimes, you have to bite your tongue and take a step back and just, let the room go. Leading with question is always the best idea. And not leading by asserting, your opinion, your point of view right away, asking open-ended question, which is hard, it's really something you have to work on and be conscious of. And I won't tell, there are some days I'm better than others or worse than others at that, but that creates way more psychological safety. And then if there is feedback to be given on on specific behaviors or the things that have been shared that are not appropriate to share in the room, you do that in a very timely manner. You don't let a month go. You give that feedback very shortly afterwards to the person, but, one-on-one with context and with the right setting. And that is, those one-on-one conversation, there is what's happening in the room, what's going to happen outside of the room. This is equally important.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. Because over the years, worked with a lot of organizations where here and there's the person that didn't get that direct feedback immediately, and it becomes a problem over years. And at that point, it's very difficult.
Yeah, or the person is going to get feedback in front of everybody else and feel absolutely awful.
Yes.
It can be devastating and truly a killer in terms of, trust in the team.
And so I always try to give advice to leaders to be really aware of when they give recognition and when they do the opposite, and making sure they're very careful, because people never forget that negative, that one sting in front of other people. They never forget that. So being
Yeah.
really aware, people are, we're human beings, and we're so much more sensitive than we think. So bringing that up to just be that kind of that safe space too, as a female leader in more of a global context, what unique, specific perspectives, challenges have you encountered? How could others make sure that they're more inclusive of everyone, and they create that safe space too? And just being aware of cultural background. For example, I was wanting to understand a little bit more about different backgrounds, different cultures where people are from. So I was reading some books on it. So culturally, how do you help either your team or help others, mentor others to be more aware of the cultural differences too that people have, and making sure they create that safe space?
Yeah, it's an important question. At the same time, it can be a very delicate question and sensitive. Not everyone is ready to share on their heritage,
Sure.
culture, whether they've been born and raised in a different country, or they've been raised in a household, with a different heritage. You need to be very cognizant of that, and not projecting. Again, we're talking about stereotypes. For
Yeah.
some people, it's not going to be very comfortable. So that is the first thing. But then, as a leader, if you're either, comfortable through, when it can be through one-on-ones, and sharing, what's your own style, or understanding, what other people's style. There are many different ways where you can understand that. I think it's a very good thing to do.
Yeah.
And there is ways to ask question or to share, without putting people in an uncomfortable space. It's true also there are some real cultural differences, between countries. And I remember, sharing, I was at Bristol Myers Squibb, and I had one of my team members was based in China, Chinese in Shanghai. And at some point, we realized, that we were actually closer in terms of culture between France and China than probably between France and the US.
Oh, wow.
And that was a powerful moment, because I was like, oh yeah, I had not thought about that, and it sounds like there's more of those cultural traits, which are in common. We value very much the team, the collective dimension. There is a level of directness, which is absolutely not bothering, in either culture. And that might be very different, with the US. So I
No,
think being cognizant of those differences, and again, that goes back, being curious and learning is really important, because then you can start, well, not only being more cognizant of your own style, but also be mindful of what is going to be difficult for others to receive,
yeah.
and apprehend, with your own style, or help, others, with other team members, in the way they're expressing themselves. They don't necessarily mean, what they say, but that's the way it's coming forward. Let alone when you're not speaking your own language, sometimes words can be stronger than you want to.
That's such a great point too. The reality is, when it goes back to when there's true empathy, there's care, and it shows that you're really interested in that person, right? You really want to get to know them, that it's coming from a place of complete respect, and you just want to know, and you're just curious. So that's really great advice. So I definitely want to take this to as a mom, as a busy professional leader, just as a mom of three.
Yeah.
How do you create work-life harmony? Because I don't think there's really ever balance. There's probably never been balance. But for you, what are things that you value that could help others?
Yeah. And it's something which is, I think it's always work in progress in a way. And I think for women, it comes also with a lot of pressure, whether you're putting a lot of pressure on yourself to be a perfect professional, to be a perfect partner, to be a perfect mom, to be a perfect whatever, and perfect daughter, sister. And these might sound like stereotypes. The reality is that, yes, there is those stereotypes, very often come true,
Yeah.
whether you like that or not, and you might not fall in some of them, but you still have, that notion of, I want to be there for the moment that matters. And I want to be there, so that I I'm also, I'm here for others, I'm taking my part. So how to create this, again, I think it's very personal. One other defining moment in my life was, my eldest daughter. I was transitioning between two companies, and I was very stressed out because it was like, okay, I'm looking for my next step. I'm going to leave this company, and I don't know yet, where I'm going to go.
Yeah.
And I remember my daughter. She was, I don't know, maybe she was 6 or 5, and she told me, well, Mom, relax and go back to work. And that was like, oh my God, she nailed it. She was telling me basically, you don't need to be a perfect mom. You don't need to be at home. You don't need to be on everything we're doing, and you just go to work, you relax and be yourself, and you're going to be fine. And that was such an eye opener. I was like, yes, I'm trying again, to wear a suit, which is not my suit. And it's not fitting well. Now, I've learned over time that it's important to be there, for a moment that matters, and carve out that time. And the world will continue revolving and nobody is indispensable, which was also a great learning from my first boss. So I'm really taking that time, as much as I can. And if I can't, I explain why I can't be there. Yesterday night, I took the time to go and see the exhibition that my youngest has been setting up at Rutgers. She's an English major and she's been co-leading the exhibit on the centennial of James Baldwin. And I went there, and that was fantastic. And that was an important moment for her. That was an important moment for me.
I love that. Yeah, so that's what you say is so interesting, because when as a mom, wife, sister, etc., right there, I do really believe there's so much pressure put on us to do everything and to be perfect and to be the caretaker for family members, and sometimes people pleasing comes into that too, right? And so I think we're just nurturers by nature, and so it's really hard for us to turn that off. Are there times with your daughters that you're trying to teach them to take care of them first too?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, these are part of the conversations we're having, because they have to protect themselves, and you cannot be at the top on everything, and you have to protect yourself. You need to protect your own energy. If you're tired, don't try to stretch yourself, another mile. It's not sustainable and realistic.
And how old are your daughters?
25, close to 22, and close to 19.
They're learning some really great lessons. I mean, you not a doubt such an inspiration to them too. But I love that you're also, from your learnings and your mentors, giving back to them to help them understand how they can be still successful and still not do everything for everybody, and it's okay not to be perfect. Is there a tool or a tip that you would provide to anyone, whether it's women or to daughters, or it's just young men in general, people just in general, on how they can control stress? Because I think stress and burnout is becoming one of those things, and it comes from either places of perfection or just expectations to do everything. Is there a couple things that you might do or suggest to manage it?
Yeah, and I've done that only recently. So it took me decades to get there. I would say finally, if my husband was listening to us, he would be laughing, very, very loudly. Protect your sleep. I would say protect your sleep. You need to sleep. I've been deprioritizing my sleep for decades. I'm not joking. Thinking, well, it's okay. Now I'm really taking care of this, and I'm not trying to fight it. And honestly, that has decreased my level of stress or my ability to navigate, through tough days more than muscling through another hour of work, another hour of preparation. Sleep is more important than anything else.
Oh
Sleep
my gosh.
and exercise, a good life hygiene. It's very simple. To be honest, it is so simple that we may not pay enough attention and put enough effort on that. It is the most important thing.
I'm so glad that you're saying that. I've been telling people that for the last 5 years, because I had the same burnout, and I sleep more and I work out all the time, and I just see I have so much more energy, and I want to see gone are the days of who got the least amount of sleep and who got more. Like, where we're competing and saying, Chantal, I got 7 hours. How many did you get? And you're saying you got 7.5. Like, that's what I want to see.
Yeah,
That's
but
wonderful.
it's very, very helpful. As a matter of fact, it's now that you have days which are stressful, but if you've got the right energy, you can navigate that so much better. And again, it's for you, it's for others.
It is. Yeah, like you said before, protecting others.
Yes.
Sleeping can protect others. And then what is there something for you that's one or two habits that just help you stay inspired or just motivated every day? Like I do love gratitude journaling. I love meditation.
Part of my routine is to go walk, for an hour every day. I've taken that habit, or actually years ago now, probably it's a habit of at least 10 years of going out, and whether, rain or shine, it's night or day, whatever, but I'm going out and I'm walking with my husband, and we're talking about everything and anything, we can share on our day. We can talk about the family. We can talk about a podcast. We can talk about a book. We can talk about so many different things, or silly things, and joking like teenagers. And to me, this is a great inspiration, because I had so many haha moments, during those walks. And same for him, it's something we really cherish. I'm not good. I've tried to do journals. I've tried to do all these things on a daily basis. This is really the one thing I've been sticking to now for a long time.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. What a difference just getting outside of fresh air and natural light when you're in the office and it's fluorescent light all day, right? That's a beautiful thing. And just that conversation has to be super special.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're really looking forward to that. I mean, even if it's a small tour because it's late at night, we're doing it.
Great.
It's really rain or shine. I mean, you need to have a storm to keep us inside.
I love that. I'm going to take some advice from you, because I've been saying I need to do a walk every day, even if it's snowing. So I will do that. That will be my commitment for this year. I love that. It's a great habit. And then just as we kind of wrap up, Chantal, I know you must have so many people in your life that inspire you, but who inspires you just every day?
Well, I don't know if it's every day. Well, I have, I would throw out, two names. One is my grandmother, my father's mother. She was born at the beginning of the 20th century, 1902, and she's always been, she's been very independent. Had a high school diploma, which at the time was not so common, for women in France. And she said, well, if I'm not getting married, by X, I'm just going to go and study to be a doctor. And of course, that was like a terrifying idea for the family. And they were like, oh my God, I mean, we need to get her a husband, and which was very difficult because that was out of World War I. And there was not so many men who were actually available. There were more women than men. So she got married, but she's been keeping that very independent mind. And she's made a point teaching that to her granddaughters. And I had the privilege, to live next to her for, my first 17 years. And I really took advantage of her wisdom. And she was a very strong woman. She was not the usual, like, warm and type of grandmother. But she taught me something else, and she's a great inspiration to me. She's been a great encouragement. The other woman that I find, particularly inspiring, and I've listened, about her life, and is Angela Merkel, which is someone she's been managing to the top, but her story is absolutely incredible, from Eastern Germany, being a scientist, to becoming, a politician, and one of the most powerful politician women in the world. And you can say, well, successful or not successful, but she's been really able to print a different style versus a Margaret Thatcher, who was probably more controversial. But she's a very admirable leader. I think she's been also able to display empathy, stay true to her values, share, with others, and drive one of the part of, she's been leading this country, for such a long time. And I would say, with great success.
I love that. I love that. Two great people that inspire you. And I'm sure things always change, but what a great cool story with your grandma, great role model. Is there, so if there's anything else that you want to add, I want you to close out just with what, it's a question and some people aren't quite sure, but what type of legacy do you want to leave behind? And not just as a leader, that could be as a mom, it could be as a friend, a manager, but what type of legacy would you want to leave behind? I'm just curious.
Oh, that's a powerful question indeed. I would really like people to remembering that I've been helpful. Even if it's small help, small advice or a simple question, that help somebody in their life to move forward. I think this is the type of legacy I would like to leave. I'm not looking for any grandiose legacy or, being famous, but if I made a difference in individual's life in a positive way, then, I'm a happy camper.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, it sounds like Chantal, honestly, had so many great people around you, but it always takes the person that is open-minded to want to learn from all those experiences. I know when we first just chatted, you had so many inspirational mentors throughout your career, and it's inspiring. I hope this inspires a lot of other leaders to make sure that they're that mentor that develops others, because it can make such a lasting impact. But just, so grateful for the time that you took, and for the people that will be listening, that will get some tidbits and real inspiration from you and your style.
Well, one thing when we're thinking about, being a woman in those days and being a leader, woman's leader in those days, I think it's important that we're continuing to educate, advocate, being patient, but also deliberate in the way we're making things progress. It's never a done deal. And I think the word is not necessarily always going in the direction we would like it to go, but we can all do our share. And, with empathy, with support, with curiosity, with a learning mindset, I think we can make it progress.
I love that. I love that. Thank you so much, Chantal. And I'm so excited. Thank you so much for your time. It was an absolute pleasure.